The land was wide, empty, and silent. The sun was hot during the day, and the nights were colder than ice. In the middle of this lonely desert stood an old wooden ranch house. It was strong but tired, with broken fences around it and dust covering the windows. Inside lived John, a retired human soldier. His hair was gray, his face rough, and his eyes heavy with memories. For years he had lived alone. He woke up with the sunrise, fed the few animals he still kept, worked the fields with slow hands, and went to bed when the stars filled the black sky. No one visited. No one came near his land. The silence was his only companion. He liked it that way, or at least he told himself so. People meant trouble, and John had seen enough trouble in his life. He had fought wars, traveled to distant worlds, and watched his friends die. When he came back to this planet, he wanted only peace. So he built his ranch and closed his doors. The locals in the nearby town sometimes talked about the old soldier in the desert, but none of them had the courage to disturb him. They knew he didn't want company. He was a man who had buried too many memories. But on one cold night, something changed. John was sitting near his small fire, drinking a cup of strong black tea. The wind was howling outside, pushing dust against the windows. He leaned back in his chair, eyes half closed, when he thought he heard something strange. At first, he ignored it. The desert had many voices, crickets, shifting sands, broken wood creaking in the wind. But then, it came again. A faint sound, almost like voices. Not one, but many. He sat up straight and listened harder. There it was again, softer than the wind, but real. His soldier's instincts woke inside him. He reached for the old rifle that still rested near the door. The same rifle he had sworn never to use again unless it was life or death. John opened the door and stepped into the night. The air was bitter cold. The moonlight spread across the ranch, silver and sharp, making every shadow look alive. He walked slowly, boots crunching on the dry earth, and then he froze. At the edge of his gate stood a group of figures, 11 of them. Tall, thin shapes, wrapped in torn cloaks, shivering in the night wind. For a moment, John thought it was a dream, or maybe ghosts from his past. But then one of them lifted her head. The moonlight revealed her face. Her skin was not human. It was pale with a strange glow, her eyes large and full of sorrow. She was an alien. And when John looked closer, he saw all of them were alien women, standing together, staring at him like lost shadows. They did not move at first. They only watched him. John tightened his grip on the rifle, his old soldier heart beating faster. Why were they here? No one came to his ranch. No one even dared to cross this desert at night. Finally, one of the women stepped forward. Her voice shook as she spoke, but the words were clear in his language. Please, shelter. Just shelter. Her voice broke, and the others bowed their heads as if ashamed. John frowned. He didn't understand. Who were they? Why had they come here? He looked at them again. Their clothes were torn, their faces tired, their eyes hollow from hunger. They looked like they had walked for many days, maybe even weeks. He could see their hands trembling in the cold. These were not warriors. These were survivors. Something deep inside John's chest stirred. He remembered the refugees he had once seen during the war, women and children running from fire while soldiers like him fought behind. He had promised himself never to be part of such pain again. But here it was, standing at his very gate. One of the alien women fell to her knees. She looked weak, her body shaking as if she could not stand any longer. The others rushed to help her, but they were weak themselves. John lowered his rifle slightly. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice rough and hard. They looked at each other, and another woman finally spoke. "Widows," she whispered. "We are widows. No one will take us. No one will help us. You are our last hope." The word hit him like a stone. Widows. 11 alien widows, wandering across the desert, begging for a place to rest. John looked up at the sky. The stars shone cold and bright, and the silence of the desert pressed against his ears. He could turn them away. He could close his gate, walk back into his house, and pretend this never happened. That was the safe thing to do. That was what he had always done. But as he looked into their eyes filled with fear, grief, and exhaustion, he felt something he had not felt in years. Responsibility. The old soldier inside him whispered, "They need you." He stood there for a long moment, torn between the peace of his lonely life and the sudden storm standing at his gate. The wind howled again, lifting the cloaks of the alien women, making them look even smaller, even weaker. The one on her knees whispered again, so softly he almost missed it. "Please." John's hands shook. Not from fear, but from the weight of the choice before him. He had lived alone for so many years. He had built walls around his heart and his home. But could he really let 11 widows freeze to death outside his ranch? Could he carry that guilt? His jaw tightened, his eyes narrowed, and he slowly lowered the rifle completely. Without a word, he turned and walked back toward the house. For a second, the women looked at each other, confused. But then John stopped at the door, glanced back, and said only one thing. "Come in." The gate creaked open. 11 alien widows, shivering and exhausted, stepped onto his land. And as John closed the gate behind them, he felt it deep inside his chest. His quiet, lonely life was over. Something new had begun, something dangerous, something heavy, but maybe something worth living for. Inside the old wooden house, the air was warmer, but still heavy with silence. The alien women stood close together near the doorway, their eyes moving around as if they could not believe they were allowed inside. Dusty lamps lit the room, throwing soft yellow light across the walls. John placed his rifle against the table and studied them with his tired soldier eyes. He did not speak at once. Years of living alone had made him careful. Trust was not something he gave easily, and yet here were 11 strangers, not even human, standing in his home like lost shadows. He cleared his throat and pointed toward the benches near the fire. "Sit," he said simply. His voice was low and rough, the kind of voice that carried command. They obeyed without a word, moving slowly as if afraid they might be chased away. Their cloaks were torn, their feet bruised, and their faces pale from hunger. For a moment, no one said anything. Only the crackle of the fire filled the silence. Then one of the women, the same one who had begged outside, lifted her head and whispered, "Thank you." Her voice trembled, and she bowed her head again. John walked to the small stove and poured water into a pot. He had little food left, but he found some dry bread and beans. He placed them in front of the women. They looked at the food with wide eyes, almost like frightened children. At first, none of them touched it, until finally one reached out with shaking hands and broke a piece of bread. The others followed, eating slowly, carefully, as if the food might disappear. John sat back in his chair and watched. Something inside him softened, though he tried not to show it. After a while, when the fire grew brighter and their breathing calmer, John asked, "Who are you really? And why are you here?" His eyes narrowed as he looked at them one by one. They exchanged nervous glances, but no one spoke. Finally, a tall woman with silver skin and deep green eyes lifted her head. Her voice was quiet, yet strong. "We are widows. Our husbands are gone. Some died in war, some were taken, some never returned. Our people, they cast us out. They said we bring bad luck. They said widows are a curse." Her voice cracked at the last word, and she looked down at her hands. Another woman, smaller and thinner, began to cry softly. She tried to cover her face with her hands, but her shoulders shook. John's heart tightened. He had seen soldiers cry in battle, but this sound was different. It was not fear for themselves, but pain too deep to hide. Another widow put her arm around the smaller one, whispering in a strange language that John could not understand. He sat quietly, listening, waiting for more. Soon, they began to speak one after another, as if the fire and the food had unlocked something inside them. One told how her husband had been a miner, buried alive when the enemy bombed the caves. Another said her partner was taken as a slave, never to be seen again. A third widow told a darker tale. Her husband had refused to join the enemy clan, and so they killed him in front of her eyes. Each story was heavy, filled with pain and loss. By the time they finished, the room was thick with sorrow, as if the walls themselves were listening. John leaned back in his chair, staring into the fire. He remembered the battlefield, the screams, the silence after gunfire. He had seen women like these before, but never had he imagined he would one day share his roof with them. For years, he had avoided people because he did not want to carry their stories, their pain. But now, 11 voices sat in front of him, each one heavy with grief. And though he wanted to stay cold, he could feel their pain crawling into his heart. "You came a long way," John said slowly, "and still you found me. Why?" His voice was suspicious, yet curious. The tall woman lifted her eyes again. "Because we heard of you," she said softly. "The human who lives alone, the soldier who fought but then walked away. We thought maybe you would understand. Maybe you would not turn us away." Her words struck him deeper than he expected. He wanted to deny it, to tell them they were wrong, but inside he knew she was right. He did understand, too well. The fire popped, and sparks flew upward. John rubbed his hands across his tired face. He had lived alone for so long because he wanted peace. But peace felt different now. 11 pairs of eyes were on him, waiting, hoping. He looked at them carefully. Some were strong even in their sadness, others so fragile they could barely lift their heads. They were not soldiers. They were not dangerous. They were broken souls searching for a place to rest. The smaller widow who had cried earlier spoke again, her voice like a whisper. "We have nowhere else to go. If you send us away, we will die." The words hung in the air like a knife. John's chest tightened. He had heard those same words once, long ago, from a child in a war zone. He had not been able to save that child. The memory still haunted him. Could he let history repeat itself right here on his land? He stood up suddenly, pacing the wooden floor. His boots made heavy sounds on the boards. The widows watched him with fear, unsure of his decision. He stopped near the window and stared out at the dark desert. The stars looked cold, distant, unforgiving. He clenched his fists. He could push them out, close the door, and return to silence. But the silence would not be peace anymore. It would be guilt. Turning slowly, he faced them again. Their eyes were wide, filled with fear and hope mixed together. John took a deep breath, his voice rough. "You can stay tonight. Tomorrow, we'll see." Relief spread across their faces like light breaking through clouds. Some whispered thanks, some simply bowed their heads. John walked back to his chair and sat heavily, as if the weight of the world had dropped on his shoulders. He did not know what tomorrow would bring. All he knew was that his lonely ranch had changed forever, and the silence of his life was already gone. The night was heavy with cold silence, and the desert air pressed against the wooden walls of the ranch. Inside, the fire burned low, throwing orange shadows across the faces of the alien widows. They sat close together on the floor and benches, their cloaks wrapped tight around their thin bodies. The smell of beans and old bread still lingered in the air, but now their hunger was calmed. Yet their eyes showed no peace. They were strangers in a strange house, and the weight of fear clung to them like dust on the floor. John sat in his wooden chair, his rifle leaning against the wall beside him. He was not used to company, especially not 11 alien women in his living room. His eyes moved from face to face, studying them. Their movements were careful, their voices soft when they whispered to one another in their own language. They looked around the room as if expecting someone to drive them out at any moment. John's heart was heavy. He did not know what tomorrow would bring, but he knew tonight would not be simple. When he finally stood up and began to set out old blankets, the widows watched him in silence. He spread the blankets across the floorboards near the fire so they could stay warm. One by one, the women lay down, though they did not close their eyes right away. Some stared at the wooden ceiling, others at the glowing fire, as if afraid it would fade away. The ranch creaked with the sound of settling wood, and outside the desert wind howled against the windows. It was the first night these women had ever spent under the roof of a human stranger, and none of them knew if they could truly trust him. John, too, could not sleep. He lay on his narrow bed in the next room, but his mind was sharp and restless. He had lived alone for so many years that the sound of breathing in his house felt strange, almost alien itself. He kept listening, hearing the soft shifts of bodies in the other room, the whispers in a language he did not know. His hand rested on the rifle beside him, just in case. The soldier inside him had not yet learned how to rest. Even after all these years, danger was always only one step away. Hours passed, and the desert night grew colder. The fire in the other room dimmed, filling the ranch with flickering shadows. Suddenly, the silence was broken. A scream tore through the stillness, sharp and terrified. John was on his feet before his mind could even think. His old body moved with the instinct of a soldier, grabbing the rifle and rushing into the other room. The widows were already standing, some clutching each other, their eyes wide with fear. One of them was pointing toward the window. "They found us!" she cried in a broken human tongue, her voice shaking like glass. John's eyes snapped to the window. For a moment, he saw nothing but the night outside, deep and endless. The wind rattled the glass, making it groan. He moved quickly, pushing past the women, his boots thudding against the floor. He pulled open the door, stepping into the freezing air. The cold bit at his skin, but he ignored it. His eyes scanned the darkness, searching every shadow. His hands were steady on the rifle, the barrel pointed forward. Years of training came back to him, like a shadow rising from the past. He breathed slow, careful, listening to every sound. The ranch yard stretched silent under the moonlight. The fences stood broken in places, the sand shifting like restless water. For a moment there was nothing, only the whisper of the wind. Then John heard it, a faint crunch like footsteps pressing into the sand. His eyes narrowed. He followed the sound, moving slowly, his rifle ready. Every muscle in his body was tight, waiting for the enemy he knew must be out there. He had heard enough stories from the widows to know someone might be chasing them. And if that was true, then the chase had ended here, at his ranch. Behind him, the widows gathered at the doorway, their eyes glowing faintly in the moonlight. They watched him with fear and desperation, as if his actions alone could decide their fate. John felt the weight of their gaze, but he kept his eyes forward. Another sound came, closer this time. He spun, aiming at the far corner of the ranch where the shadows moved strangely. But when the wind shifted, the shadows revealed nothing, only broken wood and drifting sand. His finger rested near the trigger, but he did not fire, not yet. He walked the length of the fence, his boots crunching the earth. The widows whispered behind him, voices tight with fear. He could not hear their words, but he knew what they meant. If the hunters had found them, there would be no escape. John's heart pounded. For years he had avoided war, avoided blood, avoided conflict. Yet here he was again, rifle in hand, protecting lives that were not his own. Something inside him stirred. He thought he had buried that part of himself long ago, but maybe it had only been sleeping. When he finally circled back to the house, the women were still huddled together at the door. Their faces were pale, their bodies tense. John lowered his rifle but did not put it away. "No one's here," he said in his rough voice, "just the wind." But the widows did not relax. Their eyes told him they believed otherwise. Fear still gripped them tightly, as if they knew something he did not. John looked out again into the desert. The wind carried the smell of smoke, faint but real. His jaw tightened. Somewhere out there, someone had made a fire. Someone had left a mark. He turned back to the widows, his eyes sharp. "If someone is following you," he said, his voice heavy with steel, "I need to know now." Silence fell again. The women glanced at each other, their lips pressed tight. They did not answer, not yet, but their silence was louder than words. John knew then that the scream had not been only fear. It had been recognition. They thought they had seen the shadows of their hunters. And if that was true, then danger was closer than he wanted to admit. The morning came slow and heavy, the desert sun rising over the horizon with a dull orange glow. John stepped outside with his rifle slung over his shoulder, his boots crunching the dry earth. The wind had carried away some of the night's cold, but it left behind strange signs. In the sand, not far from the ranch gate, he saw it. Prints. Footprints too large and too sharp to belong to the widows. He bent down and touched the ground. The prints were fresh, pressed deep into the sand, and they circled the ranch like wolves testing the fence. His soldier's eyes scanned the land carefully, and then he found more. A patch of burned soil, still black and smelling faintly of smoke, as if some energy weapon had touched it in the dark. His stomach tightened. The widows had not been wrong. Someone had been here. Someone had come close during the night while he stood with his rifle at the ready. He lifted his head slowly, his eyes narrowing at the endless desert around him. Whoever had followed them knew where the ranch was now, and they would come again. When he walked back into the house, the women fell silent. They were sitting close to the fire, whispering among themselves before his boots broke the sound. They looked up at him, their eyes wide. John dropped the rifle on the table with a heavy thud. His face was hard, his jaw clenched. He pointed toward the prints outside. "Tell me the truth," he said, his voice sharp. "Who is after you?" The women looked at each other nervously, none of them answering. Finally, the tall woman with silver skin stood up. Her hands were trembling, but her voice carried a weight. "We did not want to bring danger here. she said softly. "We only wished for a place to rest." John's voice cut like a blade. "You brought more than rest. There were men outside last night, armed, watching this place. You think I don't know the difference between shadows and hunters?" He stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "So I'll ask once more. Who is after you?" Silence filled the room like heavy smoke. The widows shifted uneasily, some bowing their heads, some pressing their hands together as if in prayer. The tall woman finally sighed, her shoulders sinking. "They are the clan of Durak," she whispered. The name came out bitter and fearful, as if even speaking it was dangerous. John frowned. He had heard of the Durak during the wars. A brutal alien clan, feared across more than one world. Raiders, killers, slavers. They were the kind who took what they wanted and destroyed what they could not keep. He had fought against their allies long ago and remembered the cruelty of their methods. His fists clenched at the memory. Another widow spoke, her voice breaking as tears filled her eyes. "Our husbands fought against them. They refused to bend the knee. They died for their honor. And now the clan hunts us because we carry their names. To them, we are nothing but spoils left behind." She shivered, wrapping her cloak tighter around her thin frame. "Wherever we go, the hunters follow. No one will take us in. No one dares to keep us. We are widows of traitors in their eyes." John's chest burned with anger, but he kept his voice firm. "And so you ran into the desert and came here?" "Yes," the tall woman said. "We heard of a human soldier who lived alone, a man who once stood against the cruel. We thought maybe you would understand." Her eyes met his, and for the first time, John saw not just fear, but a flicker of hope. He turned away, walking toward the window, staring out at the empty desert. His hands tightened into fists at his sides. He had wanted peace. He had built his life on silence, on distance from war. But now the war had come knocking on his very door, carried by 11 pairs of desperate eyes. If he sent them away, the hunters would find them easily in the desert. They would be taken, used, and broken. He knew what the Durak did to their victims. He had seen it before. But if he kept them here, the ranch would become a battlefield. His quiet life would be gone forever. He felt torn, caught between the man who wanted peace and the soldier who could not ignore injustice. The women waited, their breathing heavy in the silence. Finally, John turned around, his eyes sharp. "If you're staying here, you tell me everything. No more secrets. You hear me? I can't protect what I don't understand." They nodded slowly, one after another, their faces filled with both fear and relief. For the first time, they were telling their truth out loud, and John was listening. The youngest widow, barely more than a girl, whispered, "They will come again. They always do. They will not stop until we are taken or dead." Her words hung in the air like a shadow, pressing against everyone's chest. John walked to the table and picked up his rifle. His hand gripped it firmly, his voice steady but low. "Then let them come," he said. "This ranch isn't easy prey." The women exchanged glances, a spark of courage lighting in their eyes. They had run for so long, lived in fear for so many nights, but here was someone who did not turn away, someone who stood like a wall between them and the hunters. Yet deep inside, John knew this was only the beginning. The prints in the sand were a warning. The enemy was close. His peaceful days were gone, and the storm he had avoided for years was rising again. Only this time, it was not his war alone. It was his home, his land, and 11 lives depending on him. And once again, the soldier in him was awake. John did not waste time once the truth was out. The hunters were real, and they would come again. He could almost feel their eyes watching from the far desert. His ranch, once just a quiet home, now had to become something else, a shield. The widows sat in silence as he walked across the room, pulling old boxes from a corner. Inside were tools, wires, and pieces of old metal he had kept for years. They were useless for farming, but useful for war. He dropped the pieces on the table, the clatter making the widows flinch. "If you stay here," he said firmly, "we don't wait to be hunted. We prepare." His voice was hard, commanding like it once had been in the army. The widows looked at each other uncertainly, but one by one they nodded. Fear was still in their eyes, but also something new, trust. The next days were filled with work. John repaired the broken fences first, driving new posts into the ground. The widows helped, carrying wood and tying wires even with their weak hands. The desert sun burned hot, but they did not complain. Some of them had skills from their past lives. One widow knew how to weave strong ropes, another had learned to mend metal scraps, and one had knowledge of healing herbs. Slowly, the ranch began to change. The fences were no longer just for animals. They became barriers. Holes in the walls of the barn were patched, and the windows were reinforced with thick boards. At night, John taught them small things: how to stay low, how to listen for danger, how to carry a stick like a weapon, even if they had no rifle. At first, they were clumsy, their hands trembling, but John's rough voice kept guiding them. Hold it tighter. Aim for the weak spot. You don't need strength. You need courage. The women listened, their eyes sharp, desperate to learn. Fear had chased them for too long, and now they were willing to fight if it came to that. Life on the ranch slowly shifted. What was once a lonely house became a living place full of voices. The sound of hammers, of wood cracking, of women talking in their own language filled the air. At night, instead of silence, there was the murmur of stories. The widows spoke of their lives before, the gardens they once kept, the songs they once sang, the families they had lost. John listened quietly, his rough hands busy with his rifle, cleaning it by the fire. He never asked questions, but he heard everything. With each story, he felt the weight of their pain, and with each story, his resolve hardened. One evening, while the sky turned deep purple, one of the widows approached him. She was tall with green eyes that caught the firelight. "Why are you helping us?" she asked softly. "Others turned us away. You could have done the same." John looked at her for a long time, his face unreadable. Finally, he said, "Because I know what it means to be hunted, and because I'm tired of running from who I am." His words were simple, but they struck deep. The widow bowed her head in respect, saying nothing more. Days turned into weeks, and the ranch became stronger. Trenches were dug along the fence line. Spikes made of sharpened wood were hidden under sand. Old oil cans were filled with rocks to make alarms. If someone touched them, they would rattle loudly in the night. The widows, once too weak to stand tall, now walked with purpose. They carried buckets of water, hauled wood, and watched the desert horizon with sharper eyes. They were no longer just victims hiding behind John. They were becoming a part of his fight. But the tension never left. John felt it in the pit of his stomach every time the sun dropped below the horizon. One night, while checking the fence, he saw it, the sharp red glow of a flare rising far away into the dark sky. It burst silently, a burning flower in the distance. His jaw tightened, a signal. Someone out there was watching, and they had just called to their pack. When he returned to the house, the widows were waiting, their eyes fearful. They had seen the flare too. "What does it mean?" one whispered, her hands clutching her cloak. John placed his rifle on the table. "It means they've found us, and they're coming." The room grew heavy with silence. Some of the widows trembled. Some began to whisper prayers in their own language, and one broke into quiet sobs. John stood tall, his voice sharp and steady. "No more running. No more fear. If they want to take this ranch, they'll have to bleed for it." His words cut through the fear like a blade. The tall widow with green eyes looked at him with something close to admiration. "We will stand with you," she said. Her voice was steady now, without the trembling of before. One by one, the others lifted their heads and nodded. Some still had tears, some still had shaking hands, but they nodded all the same. That night, no one slept. The widows prepared as John instructed, placing the alarms, carrying wood for the fire, sharpening sticks. John checked his rifle again and again, the sound of clicking metal echoing in the house. The desert outside was silent, but it felt like the calm before a storm. Every gust of wind sounded like footsteps. Every shadow looked like an enemy crouching in the sand. As dawn began to break, painting the desert in pale light, John stood at the gate, his rifle across his chest. Behind him, the widows stood together, their faces pale but their eyes set. The ranch was no longer a quiet home. It was a fortress, and they were no longer just strangers. Together, they were something stronger. The flare in the sky had been a warning. The hunters would come soon. John knew it, and the widows knew it. But instead of fear filling his chest, John felt something else rising inside him: fire. For the first time in years, the soldier in him was awake, and this time, he was not fighting for a distant war. He was fighting for his home, and for the 11 lives who had chosen to trust him with everything they had left. The night fell heavy and dark over the ranch. The desert sky was full of stars, sharp and bright, but the land itself was silent. Too silent. John stood at the edge of the fence, his rifle in his hands, his eyes searching the horizon. The widows were inside the house, whispering softly, their fear thick in the air. The memory of the red flare haunted everyone. It was only a matter of time now. John's soldier's heart knew what was coming. The Duroc raiders were near. The first sound was faint, a crunch of boots on sand. John froze, his ears sharp. He crouched low, signaling to one of the widows who stood guard near the barn. She ran back inside to alert the others. The night grew heavier. Then, out of the darkness, a red beam shot across the sky, and the attack began. Figures moved quickly out of the desert shadows, tall, armored raiders with glowing weapons. Their eyes burned with cruelty. They surrounded the ranch like wolves circling prey. Energy blasts lit up the night as they fired toward the fences, trying to break through. The widows screamed inside, but John shouted, "Stay low! Stay together!" His voice cut through the fear, commanding like thunder. He raised his rifle and fired. The first raider fell into the sand, his body rolling as sparks from his weapon hissed in the dark. The others roared in anger, charging forward. The traps John had built snapped to life. Hidden spikes pierced two of them, and oil can alarms rattled loud, warning everyone that the enemy was here. The ranch was alive with noise, gunfire, shouting, the crash of wood breaking. Inside the house, the widows did not hide. They remembered John's lessons. Some carried sticks, others stones, ready to strike if the raiders broke inside. Their hands shook, but their eyes were set with courage. They had run long enough. Now they were standing their ground. John fought like the soldier he once had been. Every shot was careful, every move sharp. He ducked behind the fence, fired, then moved again. His body was older, slower than before, but his mind was sharp. The widows watched him through the windows, their fear slowly turning to awe. He was one man, yet he fought like 10. But the raiders were many. They pushed harder, firing blasts that shattered the wooden fence and burned holes into the earth. One of them reached the barn, kicking the door open. A widow inside screamed. John turned sharply, running toward the sound. He fired before the raider could strike, the shot echoing like thunder. The alien fell to the ground, but more were coming. Smoke filled the air as parts of the ranch began to burn. Flames licked at the dry wood, casting a red glow over everything. The widows coughed as they tried to put out the fire with buckets of sand and water. Their thin bodies moved fast, desperate to save the only shelter they had. One of them cried out, "Don't let them take us again." Her voice was both terrified and fierce. The raiders roared as they charged again, breaking through part of the fence. John stood his ground at the opening, firing one shot after another. He felt heat on his skin, the sting of burning wood near him, but he did not move back. The widows needed him, and he would not let the enemy past him. One raider swung a heavy blade at him. John blocked it with the butt of his rifle, the force rattling his old bones. With a grunt, he shoved the raider back and pulled the trigger. Another body fell. Yet the fight was not without cost. In the chaos, one widow stumbled outside with a bucket to fight the fire. A raider spotted her and lunged. John saw it too late. The woman fell to the ground, her cloak torn, the raider's blade above her. She screamed, "Help!" John's heart clenched. He sprinted forward, firing at the attacker. The blast struck true, and the raider collapsed beside her. He grabbed the widow's arm, pulling her to her feet. Her eyes were wide with tears, but she looked at him with something more than fear. She looked at him with trust. "Don't let us be taken again," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I won't," John growled, his eyes blazing. He pushed her back toward the house and turned to face the raiders once more. His body ached, his lungs burned, but he did not stop. He could not while these women depended on him, not while this ranch stood. The battle stretched deep into the night. Sparks flew, smoke rose, and the sound of weapons filled the desert. The widows fought in their own way, throwing rocks, striking with sticks, pulling each other to safety. They were no longer helpless victims. They were survivors, and together with John, they refused to bow. At last, when the stars began to fade and the first light of dawn touched the sky, the remaining raiders retreated. They dragged their wounded back into the desert, snarling with rage. They had expected an easy hunt, but instead they had found a fortress, guarded by one human and 11 widows who would not surrender. The ranch was scarred. Parts of the fence were gone, smoke rose from the barn, and the ground was littered with burned wood and broken weapons. The widows were exhausted, their faces pale, their hands blackened with ash. But they were alive. Every single one of them. They gathered near the fire pit outside, breathing hard, clutching one another. John stood in the middle of the yard, his rifle heavy in his hands. His chest rose and fell with each deep breath. His body was tired, older than it had ever felt, but his eyes were sharp. He looked at the widows, their thin frames silhouetted against the rising sun. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then one of them whispered, her voice full of wonder, "We fought them back." The others nodded slowly, realization sinking into their hearts. For the first time in years, they had not run. They had stood and survived. Tears fell down some faces, but this time they were not only tears of fear, they were tears of strength. John lowered his rifle and finally spoke. "This is only the beginning. They'll come again." His words were rough, but there was a fire in them. The widows looked at him, and one by one they nodded. They knew he was right, but they also knew something else. They were not alone anymore. Together they had faced the storm, and together they would face it again. The smoke still drifted in the air, and the ground of the ranch was blackened with ash. The battle had ended with the rising sun, but the marks of war were everywhere. The fences were broken, the barn doors half burned, and pieces of shattered weapons lay scattered across the sand. The widows stood together in the yard, their faces pale from exhaustion, their hands trembling from the fight. But their eyes were different now. No longer only filled with fear, they carried something new. Pride. They had survived. John stood at the center, his rifle resting against his shoulder. His body ached with every movement, his arms heavy from the long night, but he did not bend. He looked at the women, each of them alive, each of them breathing. For a moment he allowed himself to feel it, the weight lifting from his chest. They had not been taken. They had not been broken. The raiders had retreated, leaving behind their dead and their rage. One of the widows, her cloak torn and her hair tangled, stepped forward. Her voice shook, not with fear, but with deep emotion. "You saved us," she said. The others nodded, whispering words of agreement. John shook his head. "No," he answered quietly. "We saved each other." His rough voice carried truth. He had fought with all his strength, but it was the women who had held the ranch together, who had thrown sand on the flames, who had stood side by side instead of running. The widows gathered closer around him. Some still wept softly, but they were tears of relief, not despair. The youngest widow, barely more than a girl, clutched his sleeve and whispered, "For the first time, I feel safe." John looked down at her, his eyes softening. He had not felt safe himself in many years, not since the wars, but here, standing among them, something inside him stirred. He realized that his loneliness had ended. He was no longer the man who lived in silence. As the sun climbed higher, the women began to work with what little strength they had left. They cleared the broken wood, gathered the weapons dropped by the raiders, and patched the holes in the fences as best they could. Their bodies were tired, but their hands did not stop. John joined them, hammering posts back into the ground, his movements steady despite the pain in his bones. Together, they rebuilt, piece by piece, the ranch that had nearly been destroyed. When the work paused, the widows sat in the shade of the house. They looked at John with quiet respect. One of them spoke, her voice steady. "We have no place else to go, no people who will take us, but here, with you, we feel alive again." The others nodded, their agreement clear in their eyes. John stood silently, looking at them. He had not asked for this, had not wanted this. Yet now he could not imagine sending them away. He walked to the edge of the ranch and stared at the desert stretching out before him. It was endless, unforgiving, but it no longer felt empty. Behind him were 11 lives that had chosen to trust him, and in their trust, he had found something he thought was lost forever. A reason to stand, a reason to fight, a reason to live. That evening, when the sky turned red with sunset, the widows prepared a small meal from what little food remained. They set it on the table in the yard, and for the first time since their husbands had died, they shared food with smiles instead of tears. Their laughter was quiet, uncertain at first, but it grew warmer as the night deepened. John sat among them, listening, his lips curling into the faintest of smiles. When the stars filled the sky, one of the widows looked at him and said, "You are our protector now, our family." Her words silenced the others for a moment, but then they all nodded in agreement. John's chest tightened. Family. It was a word he had buried long ago, but now it was being handed back to him. He did not answer right away. He only looked at the women, their tired but hopeful faces glowing in the firelight. Then finally he said, "If you call this place home, then I will protect it as home." The widows lowered their heads in respect, their hearts full. For years they had been hunted, cast out, treated as cursed. But here, in a broken ranch in the desert, they had found something more than shelter. They had found belonging. As the fire burned low and the night grew still, John stood and looked out once more at the dark horizon. He knew the Dirac raiders were not finished. They would return. They would come stronger, angrier, ready to crush what they could not claim. But John also knew something else. This time, he would not be alone. He had allies. He had people who looked to him not as a stranger, but as their guardian. His eyes turned back to the ranch. The fences were damaged, the barns scarred, but the spirit of the place was unbroken. It was no longer just a house in the desert. It was alive, filled with voices and hope. He felt the weight of years lift from his shoulders. The lonely soldier who had once closed his doors to the world was gone. In his place stood a man with a new purpose. He whispered softly to himself, words only the wind heard. "I thought this land was just dirt and wood, but it's more. It's home." His voice carried steady into the night. Behind him, the widows slept close together, safe for the first time in years. And John, the man who had once chosen silence, now carried 11 lives within his heart. The ranch was no longer empty. It was a family's last stand and its first beginning.